What if the key to finding more meaning at work is to stop focusing so much on yourself? Welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, and today I'm joined by Joffrey Fuhrer, a psychology and philosophy researcher whose work challenges a lot of our common assumptions about well-being, purpose, and meaningful work. In this conversation, Joffrey makes the case for self-transcendence, the idea that deep, sustainable meaning comes not just from knowing our own why, but from contributing to something beyond ourselves. We explore what this means for work, for morality, for service, and for the small acts of impact that connect us to what truly matters. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Joffrey, bienvenue. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Podcast. It is a delight to be able to have you. Welcome.
Merci. I'm really happy to be here to have this conversation.
Today, we're going to have a conversation about a few different things, mostly based on this really great article that you recently published about self-transcendent aspects of meaning in life and how that might apply to the way that we think about the workplace. And I say this often at the beginning of these podcasts. I'm really excited for this conversation, and it's genuinely true. Your paper was one of those papers that I read, and I was like, oh my God, I have to find and meet this man, Joffrey, and have a conversation about this. I'm particularly interested in the idea of self-transcendence, and I think that we don't talk about it nearly enough in the context of meaningful work. And so I'm excited to get into this conversation. Maybe before we do you mind just introducing yourself and telling our listeners a little bit about who you are and maybe what makes your work meaningful?
Of course, with pleasure. So, as you said, my name is Joffrey Fuhrer, and I'm a researcher in psychology and philosophy, and I like to call myself a psychosopher. It's not an official title, but I like it. I've done my bachelor and master degree in Paris. Then I went to the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences in Geneva for my PhD under the supervision of Florian Kova, one of the most brilliant minds I ever known, and is actually the co-author of this paper. So big shout out to him. It's like a really shared endeavor. And I'm particularly interested in my research in everything related to the good life, meaning well-being, self-transcendence, specific kind of emotions, but also scientific methodology and everything related to pseudo-expertise, conspiracy theory, basically. No, I'm a postdoc. I got recently, 1 year ago, big funding from Europe, from young universities for the future of Europe and Marie Sklodowska-Curie. And I'm conducting a project to better understand urban challenges and opportunities and the link to well-being and meaning. So I won't delve too much details, but that idea. I think you asked something else. Oh yeah, what brings meaning to my life? What brings meaning?
Just that question.
Or my work.
That's right.
Yeah. Very, very light, easy question. So yeah, obviously, I'm really grateful for that. I'm really privileged to do a work that I'm passionate about. So it's just not just a work for me. It's also a passion. So obviously, this brings a lot of meaning in my life, but also just having loved ones, friends, spending time with friends, and just trying, to contribute to their well-being. And this is what basically brings a lot of meaning in my life and my work.
Yeah. Let's keep on that meaning track and kind of start with the basics. For people who've listened to this podcast, I think we're, well into our 60th episode and beyond. There's lots of people who've come on this podcast talking about what how they defined meaning or meaning and purpose or or mattering or any of those things. So why don't you start us with what do you think are the basics of meaning in life? And perhaps even more importantly, what do you think is missing from the way that it's often conceived?
So you probably already covered that on your previous episodes, but let's say there is some kind of consensus over what is called the tripartite model. You can find this model in the work of Frank Martella, Michael Steger, Laura King, Ein Selman. And basically, the main idea is that it is a psychological, meaning is a psychological experience that is constituted of three separate dimensions, but interconnected. You have a motivational one, purpose. So it's about being motivated towards specific purpose that will keep you motivated to invest your time and your energy towards specific tasks and towards specific concrete pragmatic goals in your day-to-day basis. Then there is a cognitive component, coherence. It's about the worldview you have, what you can understand, comprehend, what can be seen, perceived sometimes as like the chaos of the world, like everything going on, all those the stimuli. So it's when you're able to have a framework to understand all of that, you can make sense of your surrounding, your life, and what's going on in your life. And then there is an affective component called significance, but sometimes mattering. So that's where we start to have some debate about it. But let's, for example, if we take the model from Michael Steger and Frank Martella, the main idea is only about significance. It's only about finding value in your own life. So you feel that your life matter. And then if you go look at the work of Costin and Vignol, for example, you will find the word mattering. And here it's conceptualized as not only feeling that your life has value, but also that your life is consequential, that you are like contributing to something. But when you look at the measure, because we need measure in science to test our hypotheses, to test our theories, when you look at the measures, actually, this part of being consequential just disappear. There is only measure about whether you feel that your life matter and whether like your life has value, basically. And some other problematic items too cosmic about whether your life matter in the grand scheme of things. And it has been heavily criticized by Frank Martella and Michael Steger in the 3DM approach. And when I came in this debate, I thought that Frank Martella and Michael Steger were right to just say, let's call it significance. So meaning in life is about feeling that your life has value. But we lost something very important when doing that. That is a self-transcendent element that was conceptualized in mattering. So, and I felt that it was very important that when we experience a life as meaningful or meaningless, it's very important that we feel that we are making a difference. Well, we are making some kind of impact, whether modest or big. And feeling is not enough, and belief is not enough in science. So that's why with Florian, we have decided to more rigorously test this hypothesis of maybe there is a fourth dimension, an evaluative component that we call having a positive impact. And that's basically what we defend in this paper.
I think that this is really useful and really interesting. So, and it actually goes back to one of the reasons why this whole podcast is called Meaningful Work Matters, is the relationship between mattering and meaning is a fascinating relationship. And it's funny when I was talking to Martin Seligman at one point in the early days of even before this podcast kind of got started about a paper that I was writing with Carol Riff, which was the start of this whole entire podcast. His response to that paper was, this is great. Meaningful work is really useful, but if he were to do a retake on his PERMA framework, he may replace meaning with mattering. That like as time has evolved, he actually believes that sense of, the way that Isaac Prolotensky might bottom line it as feeling valued and valuable is actually central to what lived senses of meaning are all about. We've had many people. I mean, we've obviously had Frank, we've had Mike Steger, we've had Isaac on this podcast, we've had Zach Mercurio, many people who are kind of talking about these dimensionalities. And yet it's true when I look at the various ways that you can try to measure these things and use something like Mike's whammy scale, his meaningful work scale, it lacks that whole dimension of feeling valued and valuable in that way. So I'm glad you're doing this
Totally.
work, and I'm really interested in trying to unpack what this self-transcendence thing is all about. Can you help us understand like what self-transcendence is?
Yeah, sure. That's true. And I also, it must have been very terrific to meet Seligman. Never got that opportunity in my life, but one day maybe. I rarely go to the US, and I don't think he goes often to Europe, but maybe one day would be very happy to meet him. But yeah, anyway, this idea of self-transcendence can sound a bit fancy, but actually it's very pragmatic. It can be easily understood when we take into account the counterpart. What the counterpart of self-transcendent is being self-centered. So what can be self-centered? An activity can be self-centered. For example, while I'm living in Finland, when we go to sauna, it's a self-centered activity. We are not doing that because we want to contribute to society. We are there to have a good time, to relax, to unwind, just sometimes meditate. But an activity can also be self-transcendent. And in that case, it's the kind of activity, for example, is going to be about when you teach or when you volunteer, you're doing an activity that makes you almost forget yourself. You're doing something that is aiming at something bigger than yourself. You're like trying to contribute to something. In the case of, for example, if you are a filmmaker, when you are doing a movie, you're trying to build a part of a collective, and you're trying to build something way bigger than you. When you are a scientist or a philosopher, you're trying to build something collectively bigger than you. So that one means self-transcendence.
I'm quite obsessed with this notion these days. And no small part because I feel like there's been a loss of this idea of self-transcendence that has happened. I mean, if you look at ancient texts that talk about well-being, whether we're talking about Aristotle, whether we're talking about Ubuntu, whether we're talking about the medicine wheel, and the indigenous framework where I am, the Stoics, there's always this sense of a we, much more so than a sense of me.
Totally.
Aristotle defined eudaimonia not only in the context of individual ethics or individual flourishing, but in the politics of what society is. The polis is responsible for the eudaimonia of all of its citizens. Like that is a totally interdependent relationship. And yet it feels like over the 20th century, we've lost that we've become so focused on the me-ness of well-being, and we've forgotten the we-ness of well-being. And I feel like self-transcendence is perhaps a way of recapturing that. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Totally. And also, just as a follow-up about what you're saying on eudaimonia and what Aristotle considered to be eudaimon and what is a good life, what is really interesting is it holds true both in English translation of eudaimonia and French translation of eudaimonia. When you read some of the translation of their philosophy, of his philosophy, it's translated by happiness. But nowadays, happiness is something very self-centered, actually. It's mainly about feeling good about yourself, having leisure. It's not collective, it's individualistic. And that's very interesting because it's very misleading. As you said, it's way more than that, a demonic philosophy. So whether we talk about the Stoics, whether we talk about Aristotle. And I think we lost that, as you said, and that's why nowadays we talk so much about meaning and self-transcendence is because we have put happiness as the one value we should strive for, and it's very self-centered view of what is a good life. We lose a lot about ethics. We lose a lot about what we were talking about, self-transcendence. And I think now we are starting to reintroduce these ideas of self-transcendence being a core part of what is a good life and what is authentic life.
It seems like you are saying, just in very pragmatic terms, that self-transcendence is really about having an impact. Is that true? Like, is that the
Yeah, totally,
shortest way that we
totally.
can, like, yeah. Yeah.
Totally. I would even say that it's not about making a huge consequential impact. Even just helping someone is already something self-transcendent, because you're doing something that is not directed toward your own well-being. You're like acting toward someone else.
It's really the sense of kind of other focus. It's like it's a focus on the other and trying to have an impact on their experience, on their life, on their something beyond self.
Exactly.
Why is that so important to something like morality?
Well, like in the case of morality, if we define that very, very easily as being the set of rules of what allows us to discriminate between what is good and what is bad and what is morally permissible, I think it's very important, because like being a moral person is acting for the good of the society, of other people. So that's why I think also, and also in pro-sociality, why self-transcendence is also very important. As I said, an activity can be self-transcendent, but we can also have life orientation. We all know some people that who are more self-centered. It's a continuum, obviously. Not everyone is purely self-oriented towards self-transcendent things. I would say that's why it's so central in morality and pro-sociality.
I asked that question very pointedly because it feels like this period of time in the world, there's perhaps a bit of an attack on the way that we think about morality or pro-sociality. Like it often feels like some of the actions that we are seeing in the world on a day-to-day basis, or some of the leaders that we have within the context of the world, all around the world, are much more focused on achieving different ends that are not necessarily about the greater good. But I am curious about, what does research say about the connection between kind of self-transcendence, morality, pro-sociality? Like, what do we actually know from data?
For example, if you look at the paper we talked about, the one I've published with Florian, or if you look to another paper I've published with him, named What Makes Life Meaningful, what we found is very interesting, between the link between meaning and morality, is that on average, we deem lives that are moral more meaningful than lives that are immoral. I would even go further than that in our experimental settings. So basically, we have randomly assigned participants to certain kind of vignettes. So written stories with very control elements that we randomize. So each participant is assigned randomly, a classic experimental setting, and then they have to assess, to evaluate those lives and say whether they are meaningful or not. And on average, immoral life, meaning life that are selfish, self-centered, are deemed very meaningless compared to, it's a primary variable we found as accounting of why we consider life as meaningful or meaningless in this setting. It means like morality, the ground we need to assess whether our life is meaningful or not. So if we take a concrete example, the life of someone as Nelson Mandela would be deemed as very meaningful, because like it's considered as a moral person. It's not only for that, it's because of positive impact. It's two different things. You can be a moral person but not having a positive impact. You just have to be, I don't know, just someone nice, in your day-to-day basis. If we think about, like, I don't know, the life of Adolf Hitler, let's take like those funny example. Well, we would consider his life as quite meaningless, because of all the negative impact he has done, and his life really self-centered and immoral life.
I'm curious about this one, not least of which because, there's plenty of folks, Todd Kashdan, great example of it, who kind of has posed the Hitler problem. We'll just go there. Which
Let's
would
go.
be,
I didn't know he talked about Hitler.
yeah. So this question of, this is the challenge with morality and pro-sociality. It kind of depends on what your perspective of morality and pro-sociality is. So chances are, Hitler would actually have considered his life pretty meaningful from an Aryan perspective or trying to achieve the aims that he was, from that perspective, like, positive impact
Totally.
for some, perhaps positive impact.
Totally. Yeah, but that's what is very interesting. And that's why it's important, I think, to make a very clear distinction between the psychological experience of meaning in life. So maybe Hitler would have, and probably he felt that his life was meaningful. I have another paper with Céline Schopfer and also Florian Kova, where we find that people believing in conspiracy theories, they tend to believe that because they make them the feeling that they can have a positive impact and that make their life more meaningful. And it's important to make the distinction between the psychological experience and objectively, can a life be considered as meaningful?
Mm.
And this is more a philosophical debate. So then we can debate whether there is an objective meaning that we can say someone can be wrong about saying my life is meaningful. So maybe Hitler, we could defend on a philosophical account certain name objectivist that he was wrong. But if you incline more toward what we call a subjectivist view of meaning, we could say, well, whatever goes, if he experiences life as meaningful, well, who we are to say he was right or wrong. It's important to make this distinction. There is two different things: the psychological experience and the ethical evaluation of whether a life is meaningful or not.
Within your research and the vignettes that you post, did those kinds of normative differences ultimately show up in any way?
Yeah, that was very interesting. When you use a third-person experiment, as we did with the vignettes, people are very prone to say, when we provide them a vignette of a character very immoral, they will say, yeah, his life is meaningless. But if we ask them whether this character experiences life as meaningful, they would say, yeah, probably. When we ask them objectively, is this a meaningful life? They tend to say, no, it's not a meaningful life. So statistically, it seems that at least in Western countries, because we haven't tested that in other culture, it seems to that we have an intuition that there is some kind of objectivity whether life can be meaningful or not.
How do you think that this translates into the workplace?
Good question. And I think it's also important to say that there is things that those kind of research can contribute to what is a meaningful work and what it can't. What is very interesting when you look at the scientific literature is that it's two very different areas of research. Meaning in life is different as finding that your work is meaningful. They can overlap and your work can contribute to the meaningfulness of your life, but overall, it's different. And I would say it's quite interesting to see that when we look at the literature, for example, we were talking about Frank Martella he also published in the field of meaningful work. And he tend to defend that what we deem as our meaningful work is when you feel that your work is significant. It is about work significance as an overall evaluation of work, as regard whether it is intrinsically valuable and worth doing, and the purpose as work serving some greater good. So that was very interesting. In those kind of framework, you find also this idea of positive impact. It's not only as like feeling good at work, it's also about self-transcendence, positive impact. They also talk about self-actualization.
It's a really interesting thing. There's also another researcher whose name is Mario Lipswiersma, who's based in New Zealand, and also does really interesting work in the space of meaningful work and the ways in which it's conceptualized. And I think that her perspective and Frank's perspective are probably quite similar in terms of both the orientation on myself versus an other. She also categorizes, she kind of has a 2x2 that talks about meaningful work as being both self-focused and other-focused, and also very much focused on either kind of being or doing. So I can have, something that is very self-focused and very much oriented around a sense of being the best that I can be, really living into my values. I can be self-focused and very much focused on kind of bringing my strengths to bear, really using my strengths. Or I can be other-focused and be very focused on being part of community, valuing a sense of belonging. or I can be other focused and be very focused on doing, which would, I think, probably be the quadrant that you're talking about most in terms of having an impact on others, being of service, supporting in some way, shape, or form. I'm curious about like work that is not necessarily paid work, because I do think that
Yeah.
in our lives, we often think about serving others, having an impact, pro-sociality, most in the context of probably the work that we do. I think that we think about it in terms of the
Totally.
families, we think about it in terms of our communities, but I think work takes up an immense amount of time. But so does volunteerism, like work that's not necessarily paid. And I'm curious if you have any takes or perspectives on the role of this positive impact, which really seems like what volunteerism
Mhm.
is ultimately all about.
Yeah. So what's interesting when we look at the data and the studies, it seems we don't have a causal proof yet, but let's say it's very likely that overall people volunteering tend to have more meaning in their lives. So we can find that at different age, from like young adult to elderly. So an elderly is very interesting because oftentimes we know that it's a population suffering, especially in Western countries, from isolation. So volunteering is also probably bringing them a sense of belonging and a sense of they still matter. And I don't have any, let's say, big take about the relation between volunteering and work, as we have obviously to work, put food on the plate. So that it's important. And some of us who are very lucky to have passion and or work aligned. And unfortunately, there is also a lot of work bringing meaninglessness. And in those cases, what is very interesting is when you can't get meaning from your work, you can get it maybe from volunteering if you still have time or energy. For example, that's very interesting to look at the old work of Viktor Frankl. So I'm sure your auditors are familiar, famous intellectual psychiatrist. He is also very well known to advise his clients to do volunteer when they were going through existential crisis. It was often something he would advise his clients because the problem when you're like going through an existential crisis and some kind of depression, so we are not talking about like just pathological depression but just feeling depressed, in general you tend to be like a black hole, like you just tend to be very self-centered because you don't have the energy and the motivation to do anything else. And volunteering is basically the total opposite of that. It forces you to be self-transcendent. It forces you to invest your time and energy toward the well-being of others. So I have some like just an anecdote about it. I remember when I was still a student. I come from a very popular family, so I didn't have any money to live in Paris. And Paris is very costly; it costs a lot of money. And I found a way to volunteering association. I found a way. So basically, it connected me with an elder person. In exchange of a very low rent, I would spend time with her and just like be with her to do activities and to do just like bring some of my time and energy to bring a bit more of happiness in a life. And it's even in the when sometime I was feeling depressed, when I was feeling very bad, it's always something that cheered me up. Uh, every time I was like going with her and just share time with her and try to do an activity she liked. And every time I would see her smile and see her happy, I would just forget about all my problems and everything. I was like, just okay, it's just no, I'm not focusing on myself anymore. It's kind of yourself and your problem disappear.
I love that anecdote. It is very useful and I think very, very powerful to be able to remember. There's a program that I am currently involved with in the city of Toronto in Canada, and it's with an organization called Civic Action, and we've created this program that's called Youth Civic Corps. And the premise of Youth Civic Corps is to be able to work with young people, people who usually are kind of out of high school up until kind of early professionals, and people who come from very diverse perspectives, who might not necessarily have had the opportunity to really get leadership experience, to be part of the communities that they're trying to see around them. And the premise of this program is to give people a really meaningful volunteerism experience, an
Mm,
experience that will actually
it's
allow
lovely.
them to build leadership capability, to be able to do something that they wouldn't necessarily have had the opportunity to do, something that will ideally help them with their vocational attainment, help them maybe get a job in the future by giving them different kinds of experiences, throwing them into challenging experiences. I think one of the things that we have really tried to focus on in this program is to try to find ways of helping people who are participating in this program understand and really craft as meaningful a volunteer experience as possible. And that is so much rooted in this idea of self-transcendence. And I think that maybe one of the things that we're
Totally.
surprised by as we're starting to see the results of the first cohorts kind of coming out of this program is the transformation that it's having on people's sense of optimism, people's psychological capital, their hope, their self-efficacy, their
Mhm.
resilience, their possibility of being able to feel like they really can have an impact in the world and
Mhm.
that they
Mhm.
really do matter and that they're also part of something that is so much bigger. It's incredible. And people just feel like they're part of this extraordinary community when they're going through it.
Mhm. Mhm. That's a wonderful program.
Mm.
But,
It's
but
a
yeah, I think it's really important to bring that into education because sometimes when we grow up, we can even forget how important it is to be self-transcendent oriented sometimes because like at some point, like just routine in life. And I think that's very a great thing for like a teenager or even young adults or even adults to just to be reminded how it feels when you just like volunteer, when you give your time and your energy, not just for you, but for something bigger and to be part of something bigger than just your own like pleasure on your own routine.
hmm. It's a call for more service learning in our lives.
I
That is
think
what that
so.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also it's very important to be taught that what matter is not only like sometimes we are living in such a big world that sometimes we feel like what we are doing is inconsequential,
Mm,
that we are like just a tiny grain of sand lost in the middle of the cosmos. And it's important sometimes also to be reminded of that. It's like some small gesture that matters. Sometimes even just helping someone in the street or just helping your neighbor or just doing those little things just for the sake of doing those, intrinsically motivated to do those, it's something that can remind us that just having a positive impact is not only to like change a politic or like be a Nelson Mandela. We can just be the guy helping a grandpa or a granny carrying a grocery bag.
absolutely. If you were to leave our listeners with a question that they could ask themselves, especially at work, if they're feeling a little bit like a grain of sand in the ocean of their workplace, to try to think a little bit about a prompt for self transcendence at work, what would you suggest somebody think through?
I would say a very simple question. Whether in your life or within your work, whether you actually experience self-transcendence and especially flow. Does this experience of flow is when you lose track of time, when you lose track of your own self and you just disappear into your activity and you're like just you're being purely oriented toward inside this activity. And I think it's a kind of reminder of this Socratic teaching of knowing yourself. So I would say, to reflect on that, whether what you're doing is aligned with your own value and whether you're experiencing this self-transcendence, psychological experience, and this experience of flow.
Hmm. Geoffrey, merci beaucoup. I feel like this
Ça m'a fait
conversation has been
plaisir.
a self-transcendent experience. I feel very much connected to something bigger than myself as a result. So thank you so much for your wisdom today.
Well, thanks to you, Andrew. It was a very nice time.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.